The tornado sirens weren't even done screaming when Karen marched across my yard waving the violation notice like she was serving a royal decree, and for a second I couldn't decide which threat was more dangerous, the swirling sky behind her or the furious HOA tyrant stomping toward my storm shelter door. I had just swung the metal hatch open when she shouted that I was forbidden from using it, as if she thought she had the authority to negotiate with a tornado. I remember thinking that any sane person would be heading indoors or at least checking the sky instead of arguing about bylaws, but Karen never operated on the same plane of logic as the rest of humanity. The wind was twisting the treetops sideways while she accused me of endangering neighborhood aesthetic. That was the moment I realized the storm wasn't the disaster I needed to worry about. It was her. I had installed the storm shelter 2 months earlier after 3 back-to-back near misses from rotating wall clouds that skipped across my property like they were trying to choose their favorite spot to touch down. The shelter was simple, steel-reinforced, half-buried, and frankly the only reason I didn't panic every time the weather app sent a red alert. But Karen filed complaints the day it arrived, insisting it was visually aggressive, as if she were describing a wild animal instead of a life-saving structure. She had already called 2 emergency board meetings about it, though the irony was that none of the other HOA members actually cared. They thought it was practical. Karen, on the other hand, considered practicality a personal insult. So there I was, trying to decide whether to duck into the shelter or drag Karen by the arm to get her away from the gusts, whipping her hair upward like the storm wanted to take her first. She jabbed the violation notice against my chest, shouting that the HOA had ordered me to remove the shelter before it disturbed neighborhood consistency. The sky growled above us in a deep rolling rumble, and lightning snapped somewhere too close to be comfortable. I could smell ozone and dust. She didn't pause once. Her voice rose even louder to compete with the wind, ranting about property values and her authority as if the storm needed an audience. I kept eyeing the horizon because a funnel cloud was starting to twist out of the dark wall of clouds like some monstrous tail unfurling. I told her she needed to get inside. Any inside, hers or mine or even the storm shelter she claimed was illegal, and she fired back that she would rather ride out the weather in her kitchen than step 1 foot into a non-approved structure. The wind shoved her sideways and she braced herself with an indignant huff. I tried again, explaining that the sirens didn't go off unless meteorologists saw serious rotation nearby. She lifted her chin stubbornly, accusing me of exaggerating the storm for dramatic effect. Another growl of thunder rumbled across the ground and vibrated through my shoes, but she acted like it was nothing more than background noise in her personal one-woman performance. I almost laughed from disbelief, but fear gripped me too tightly to find anything funny. When the first wave of debris scattered across my driveway, tiny bits of leaves and dirt spinning like a preview of what was coming, I reached out to pull her toward the shelter. She jerked back, furious that I had touched her, and thrust her finger toward my face, sputtering about consequences, fines, and legal action. It was like arguing with a brick wall that had taken a motivational seminar on confidence. A violent gust slammed into us both, pushing me toward the shelter door and sending Karen staggering toward my flower bed. She straightened up, now even more furious, and demanded that I remove the ugly metal hole before the next HOA meeting. I wanted to scream that we might not even make it to the next HOA meeting if she didn't get inside right now. The sky shifted from bruised gray to a sickly green hue that every storm season local recognizes instantly. I felt a terror in my bones that didn't need words any more than the storm needed permission. My phone buzzed with a tornado-confirmed alert, the kind that comes with a vibrating jolt, and when I lifted it, I saw the path arrow was uncomfortably close. I held the screen out toward her, but she only glanced at it before waving it away. She shouted something about the HOA bylaws being clear and enforceable. I shouted back that the storm didn't care about bylaws. Leaves whipped between us like frantic birds, the wind shrieking higher, tugging at clothes and hair. A low, powerful roar emerged in the distance, the unmistakable mechanical-like growl of a tornado that no one ever forgets once they hear it. My stomach turned cold and hollow. I yanked the shelter door wider, forced my arm toward Karen again, demanding she get in right now. For the first time she hesitated, eyes shifting toward the horizon where a dark funnel was forming, stretching downward like a claw. But the hesitation lasted barely 2 seconds before she snapped back into her delusional certainty, claiming it would veer off like they always do. I didn't have time to argue anymore. I stepped inside the shelter, but she planted her feet like she was guarding the entrance. The roar grew louder, vibrating through the ground and the metal walls of the shelter like a living beast approaching. Karen shrieked something about not allowing me to use the shelter until the HOA had resolved my violation. She actually reached toward the door, as if she intended to shut it and trap me outside during a tornado out of pure spite. My heart slammed hard in my chest as another gust ripped across the yard and sent a lawn chair cartwheeling past us. I pushed the door open wider, forced her back a step, and yelled that I wasn't dying for her rules. She responded that she wasn't dying in my illegal bunker. The wind roared again, even louder, and the first fragments of shingles flew overhead like splintered confetti. I had no choice. I ducked inside, grabbed the door, and shouted for her once more, telling her she had 3 seconds before I sealed it. She rolled her eyes like I was being dramatic for effect. Then the roar doubled in volume, and everything in the yard bent sideways. That was the last thing I saw before I pulled the door closed and locked it from inside, heart pounding, praying she would find shelter somewhere because the tornado wasn't turning away. It was coming straight for us. And in that last split second before the latch clicked shut, I realized something chilling. The storm wasn't choosing my house. It wasn't choosing the neighborhood. It was choosing hers. Inside the shelter, the sound hit me like the world was being peeled apart outside. The metal walls vibrated with a deep rumble that climbed higher until it felt like the storm itself was breathing against the steel. I braced my hands against the bench, trying to steady myself, but the pressure changes made my ears pop hard enough to sting. For a few seconds I could only think about whether Karen had run home or whether she was still out there yelling at the wind like it was a committee she needed to dominate. Guilt stabbed through me, even though logic told me she had chosen stubbornness over survival. The darkness outside the vent slits flickered with flashes of light, and the shelter shuddered as debris slammed against the exterior like an angry fist. I kept imagining her silhouette stumbling across the yard toward her house, the one with the wide glass windows she always bragged were custom imported. The noise outside intensified until it became a roaring, swirling mass of sound so loud and relentless that it eclipsed all other thought. Dust rained down from the ceiling bolt. The air tasted metallic, thick with the strange pressure that comes when nature decides it's done tolerating human arrogance. For a brief moment I closed my eyes and wondered if I should have tried harder to pull her in, even though she had fought me at every turn. But the tornado didn't care about guilt or intentions, and the shelter shook again, jerking me back into the present as something heavy thudded above, sliding and scraping like it was being dragged by invisible claws. I crouched lower, gripping the steel floor while the whole structure vibrated. A monstrous howl tore across the yard, rising and falling like the storm was screaming through every fence, every tree, every empty space. I tried to breathe slowly, but every inhale came tight and thin. A loud metallic clatter struck the shelter hatch, and my heart nearly stopped. It was as if the wind had decided to beat a warning against my only protection. The pressure changed again, the air dropping then rising in my chest, as if the atmosphere was squeezing. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands. The timer on my phone said only 3 minutes had passed since I locked the door. 3 minutes felt like half an hour in that roaring metal cave. Another violent jolt shook the shelter, and the vent flashed with a blinding burst of lightning that revealed swirling gray debris whipping past outside. I flinched at every unknown sound, every scraping, every thump. It was one thing to prepare for a tornado in theory. It was another thing entirely to be inside a steel box while the world above tried to tear itself apart. The roar deepened until it almost sounded like an engine, not mechanical but alive, a beast moving low across the ground. My heartbeat raced until I felt it echoing in my fingertip. Then the roar shifted direction, sliding in a way that told me the tornado's path had changed. A strange, eerie quiet settled for 2 or 3 seconds like the storm inhaled sharply. That silence terrified me more than the noise. The next blast of sound came sharper, closer, directed toward the side of the shelter where my neighbor's property sat. The image hit instantly in my mind. Karen's giant 2-story house, the one she guarded harder than her own opinions, sitting directly in the funnel's new path. I pressed my ear to the wall, not because I expected to hear words but because instinct made me search for clues in the chaos. The storm battered the earth with a new ferocity, throwing debris so hard against the shelter that the steel groaned. Another thud rattled the roof. Then a distant crash echoed through the storm, muffled but unmistakable. Something large had given way. Something structural. I gripped the bench edge, stomach twisting as images flashed through my thoughts. Her front porch ripping free. Her decorative columns snapping. That ridiculous gazebo she claimed raised property value flipping into the sky. The storm's roar drifted slightly to the right, still in the neighborhood but moving down the street. The shelter vibrated less violently, though debris still struck it in irregular bursts. I remained frozen for several minutes, counting every second in my head, waiting for some shift in tone or force that would signal the tornado had moved on. My breaths finally began to steady, though my muscles stayed tight. I didn't dare open the door. Tornadoes could loop, jump, stall, or send deadly aftermath winds even after the funnel lifted. The phone buzzed again with another emergency alert. Tornado lifted. Additional cells approaching. Remain sheltered. I waited another minute to be safe before unlatching the door. My hand hesitated on the handle because my brain wasn't ready to face the outside yet. The storm shelter had protected me, but the real damage would now be sitting above ground like the aftermath of a battle. With one slow breath, I cracked the door, and the air outside hit me like stepping into a different planet. It was cold, thick, and littered with dust and drifting insulation. My yard looked shredded. Tree limbs were scattered everywhere, my mailbox was missing entirely, and the fence was bent sideways as if someone had leaned a truck against it. A twisted piece of sheet metal lay across the grass, but it wasn't mine. The eerie quiet after the storm was almost unnatural, broken only by distant car alarms and a dog barking somewhere frantically. I stepped fully out and scanned the direction of Karen's house. My stomach to drop. Her roof was partially peeled back like a lid someone tried to open and forgot to close. A large section of siding was gone. A window had blown out completely, scattering shards across her porch. One of her garden statues lay broken in the street. But the part that made my breath hitch was the side of her front yard. It was covered in debris I recognized immediately. Pieces of her own HOA meeting tent, the one she used for her self-appointed leadership gatherings, now splintered and thrown everywhere like confetti marking the storm's aim. I jogged toward her house, not because I trusted her, but because even the most stubborn, infuriating person didn't deserve to be alone or injured after a tornado. As I approached, the wind shifted enough to carry the faint sound of someone calling out. It wasn't loud. It wasn't panic. It was sharp, irritated, and almost offended, which was the most Karen-like sound imaginable. I found her standing in the remains of her front porch, staring at the damage as if she couldn't believe the storm had chosen her house instead of mine. Her hair was wild, her clothes covered in dust, and her expression twisted in a mix of outrage and disbelief. She looked at me like I was responsible, as though my shelter had attracted the storm rather than protected me from it. Before I could speak, she pointed at the sky, then at her house, then at me, trying to form accusations through breathless frustration. Her voice cracked when she finally managed a sentence, insisting that this was somehow my fault. My shelter, she claimed, had disrupted airflow and redirected the tornado. I stared at her, exhausted, stunned, and almost impressed by the creativity of her delusion. The tornado had passed. The damage was done. But somehow Karen had found a way to turn a natural disaster into another complaint against me. And in that surreal moment, surrounded by shredded pieces of her porch, with debris still drifting through the air, I realized the storm had only been the beginning of this conflict. She wasn't finished. Not even close. The longer I stood there watching Karen clutch the broken railing of her porch like it was the last piece of authority she had left, the more the surreal weight of everything pressed in. The tornado had ripped half her house apart, and yet she seemed more furious about the idea of losing control than the actual damage around her. She kept sputtering about airflow patterns and property violations as if yelling at me could magically reassemble her roof. I wanted to argue, to shake her and remind her that I had begged her to take shelter, but the exhaustion from the storm made my voice come out steadier and calmer than I felt. I told her she needed to make sure she was uninjured before blaming anyone. She brushed it off with a sharp flick of her hand, claiming she was perfectly fine except for the emotional distress of seeing her home attacked by unconventional structures. Even after surviving a tornado, she still found a way to sound like she was writing a ticket. I offered to help her check the interior of her house, partly because it was the decent thing to do, and partly because I didn't trust her not to injure herself and blame me later. She stepped inside through the broken doorway with the posture of someone entering a crime scene. The living room was a mess of insulation, shattered glass, and toppled furniture. A section of ceiling had collapsed onto her couch. The chandelier hung sideways like it was reconsidering its attachment to the world. She pressed the back of her hand to her forehead dramatically, as if declaring despair to an invisible audience. I tried not to roll my eyes, but after everything, it was almost reflexive. She muttered about insurance, about rebuilding, about her sacred status in the HOA, each complaint layered with the disbelief that the storm had dared to choose her house instead of punishing mine. I pointed out the structural damage near the staircase and suggested she not go upstairs until a professional cleared it. She ignored the warning and took 2 steps up before the wood groaned under her feet. That finally made her stop. Her attitude wobbled for a moment, replaced by something closer to fear. She climbed back down slowly, gripping the rail as if gravity had personally wronged her. I could almost see the gears turning in her mind as she tried to reassemble her sense of control. She faced me again, determined to restore her usual authority. That's when she launched into her next accusation, claiming my storm shelter had created a barrier of disruption that redirected the tornado toward her street. She said it with such confidence that if I hadn't lived on this planet my whole life, I might have believed she had access to secret meteorological data. I tried reasoning with her again. I explained that tornadoes don't get influenced by backyard installations, that they follow atmospheric conditions, not homeowner preferences. She refused to listen. Her voice rose as she insisted the HOA would pursue this scientifically, as if she had a team of tornado whisperers ready to analyze wind spirits. I told her the only reason I survived unharmed was because I had taken warnings seriously. She snapped back that she would have survived perfectly well without my interference. Her voice cracked in the middle of the lie, betraying the truth she refused to accept. When I stepped outside, she followed me, scolding me for leaving her home in chaos, as though helping her was now an obligation of mine. I stopped halfway down her broken steps and faced her. The wind was calmer now, brushing loose debris across the road in slow drift. She stood in the doorway gripping the frame with white knuckles. I asked her one simple question. Why had she come to my yard during the warning instead of going inside her own home? Her lips tightened. She didn't answer. She only glared. I had never seen someone get defensive about almost dying, but Karen found a way to turn survival into a competition she thought she had lost. She stormed down the steps, or at least tried to. One of the boards cracked, nearly sending her stumbling, and she froze with a gasp, looking back at the damage as if the house itself had betrayed her with poor timing. She regained her balance and marched toward me with her finger already raised. I braced myself for whatever delusional thought she planned to launch next. She announced, with absolute conviction, that she would be filing an official complaint against me for hazardous actions contributing to property destruction. I waited for her to elaborate, but apparently that was the full sentence. The silence that followed said more than her words. She was terrified but couldn't admit it, so she dressed her fear in the only language she understood: authority and blame. I turned away, ready to walk back to my place and let her cool off, but she wasn't finished. She demanded I return to help secure her yard, pointing out scattered pieces of her siding and shattered decorations as if they were sacred relics. I told her I needed to check my own property. That set her off again. She shouted that my home was perfectly fine while hers was in crisis. I didn't correct her out loud, but internally I marveled at the audacity. Even after disaster tore apart her house, she still believed the universe should revolve around her. I walked away anyway. She followed me halfway down the street before stopping when she realized her shoes were sinking into wet debris. The last thing I heard was her voice echoing down the road, insisting the HOA would make me pay for all this. The neighborhood was slowly emerging from their homes, stunned faces peering through broken windows and open door frames. Some waved to check if I was okay. Others just stared at the damage. But everyone looked toward Karen's house eventually, because it was impossible not to. Her place had taken the worst of it. I felt for the other neighbors more than I felt for her. They didn't deserve any of this. Back at my yard, I surveyed the damage again. The storm shelter stood solid and untouched, practically gleaming against the wreckage around it. My house had lost some shingles, and a tree limb had crashed into the side paneling, but nothing structural was compromised. Relief washed through me, mixing with sadness for the others who weren't as lucky. While I picked up debris, I noticed the storm had dumped chunks of Karen's roof tiles all over my grass. It was almost poetic in a bitter way. Her home had scattered itself across my property, as if even the storm wanted to make a point. As I worked, neighbors began trickling toward the street, checking on each other, sharing stories of narrowly avoided disaster. Everyone spoke in hushed voices about the moment the funnel dipped. Some had barely made it to their basements. Some had watched shingles tear off houses. A few mentioned seeing Karen outside yelling in the middle of the warning, which spread confusion through the group. No one understood why she hadn't taken cover. When they asked me, I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't sure there was a way to explain her logic without sounding like I was exaggerating. They exchanged looks, some baffled, some sympathetic toward me, because they realized dealing with her after this was going to be its own kind of storm. As more people gathered at the curb, someone suggested checking the rest of the street for deeper damage. Karen appeared again, marching toward us, covered in dust but determined to reclaim control of the neighborhood. She pointed at me in front of everyone and announced that I had caused the disaster. The crowd fell silent in disbelief. I exhaled slowly, bracing for the battle she was determined to start, because it was clear that even a tornado wasn't enough to humble her. The storm had destroyed her house, but it hadn't destroyed her need for conflict. And something told me this was only the beginning of the next fight she planned to wage. When Karen pointed at me in front of the gathering crowd, the street went so quiet it felt like the wind itself paused to listen. Her hair was tangled and half covered in insulation, her clothes wrinkled and streaked with dust, but she still carried herself like the self-appointed queen of the HOA. She announced that I was responsible for the tornado hitting her house, claiming my storm shelter had manipulated airflow and interfered with natural patterns. The neighbors stared at her, then at me, then at her again, trying to process whether she was serious. Unfortunately, Karen never jokes about the things she believes. She doubles down until the belief becomes her reality. I took a slow breath, preparing myself, because this was clearly going to turn into a spectacle whether I wanted it to or not. One of the neighbors, Mark, stepped forward and gently reminded her that tornadoes don't respond to backyard structures. She brushed him off and insisted that I had created a hazard by installing something unsanctioned. Another neighbor pointed out that the HOA rules didn't mention storm shelters at all. Karen jabbed her finger at him, accusing him of questioning her authority. It was unbelievable, watching her try to reassert control amid the wreckage of her home, as if yelling loud enough could rebuild her porch. I kept quiet because the more she talked, the more the neighbors exchanged looks of uncomfortable disbelief. Some even backed away slightly, not wanting to get caught in the verbal tornado she was whipping up. She then demanded an emergency HOA meeting right there on the sidewalk. Half the people declined instantly, explaining they had families to check on or damage to assess. But Karen wouldn't let it go. She marched straight up to me, stopping inches from my face, and demanded that I take responsibility for what had happened. It took everything in me not to snap. I told her the only thing I was responsible for was my own safety, and that she had rejected the chance to be safe in the shelter when she had it. Her eyes widened, not in realization but in outrage, as if I had personally insulted her pride. She stepped back with that theatrical gasp she used whenever she needed attention, but no one rushed to comfort her this time. People were drained. They had survived a tornado. They didn't have energy for her drama. The tension built until a patrol car rolled slowly down the street, checking for injuries. The officer stepped out and asked if everyone was all right. Karen practically sprinted toward him, throwing her hands up and declaring there had been a crime. Not a weather disaster. A crime. The officer blinked at her, confused, and asked what exactly she meant. She launched into a rant about illegal constructions, airflow redirection, and negligence. He listened patiently for a few seconds before asking if she was injured or needed medical assistance. She insisted she was completely fine except for the emotional turmoil caused by me. I tried not to laugh, but I felt a small chuckle escaping when the officer turned to me with an expression that silently asked if this was real. When he asked for my version, I explained everything calmly. I told him I had installed a storm shelter to protect myself during warnings, that Karen had stormed onto my property during the sirens to serve a fake violation notice, and that I had begged her to get inside. He nodded, processing every detail carefully. Karen interrupted repeatedly, trying to twist every word. The officer raised his hand to silence her and finished taking my statement. When he asked whether she had threatened me or attempted to physically block me from the shelter, I hesitated for a moment, remembering the way she had tried to grab the door. She cut in again, yelling that she had every right to stop illegal shelter usage. The officer's expression hardened slightly. He told her that interfering with someone seeking safety during an active tornado warning was dangerous and potentially unlawful. That shut the crowd up even more. Karen looked stunned, as if the officer had just spoken in a language she had never heard before. He asked her bluntly why she hadn't taken shelter when the warning sounded. She lifted her chin and claimed she was exercising her rights as a homeowner to stand her ground. The officer blinked again, clearly unsure how to respond to such a bizarre answer. He finally just recommended she stay away from unsafe structures and let professionals assess her home. She tried to argue, but he was already walking away toward another damaged property, leaving her without the validation she had expected. As the neighbors began dispersing, Karen remained rooted in place, staring at her ruined house with a look that blended fury and humiliation. I started heading back to my yard when she suddenly declared loud enough for the whole street to hear that she would be filing formal charges against me with the HOA. No one reacted. No one supported her. Most people barely looked up. It was as if the tornado had blown away whatever influence she once imagined she had. But that didn't stop her from clinging to whatever power she thought she still held. She stomped back to her property, muttering under her breath like she was preparing for battle. I spent the next hour gathering debris, checking fence lines, and helping neighbors move fallen branches off walkways. It was strangely grounding to work side by side with people who genuinely cared about the community. Several thanked me again for trying to get everyone to take shelter. One person even said I should have dragged Karen inside for her own good, though we all knew she would have fought it like a cornered cat. The atmosphere began to shift from fear to resilience. People laughed nervously, shared stories, offered each other bottled water. Still, no matter how far I walked, I felt Karen's stare burning into me from her wrecked porch. It wasn't until later in the day that the next twist arrived. I was in my yard gathering the last pieces of debris when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see two HOA board members approaching, quiet, calm, nothing like Karen's dramatic entrances. They apologized for the intrusion and explained that Karen had already contacted them with a formal emergency complaint. They wanted to hear my side before responding to her claims. I walked through everything again, from her arrival at my yard to the final moments before I closed the shelter door. They listened, nodding slowly, exchanging looks that suggested none of this surprised them. Then they told me the part that did surprise me. Apparently, Karen had insisted that the HOA needed to investigate my property for dangerous construction, and she had demanded permission to enter my yard to conduct an inspection. They told her no. Not only no, but absolutely not, under no circumstances, and not even after repairs were done. As they said this, one of them sighed and admitted that Karen's behavior had grown increasingly unstable in recent months. She had filed dozens of baseless complaints, accused several neighbors of violating rules that didn't exist, and even threatened to fine the mail carrier for mailbox disrespect. Hearing that made everything click. The tornado hadn't broken her. She had already been cracking long before it arrived. The board members assured me they wouldn't take any action against my shelter. They even thanked me for installing it, saying more residents should consider doing the same. They shook my hand and went to check on other homes, leaving me standing there with a strange mix of relief and dread. Because while the HOA might have rejected her complaint, I knew Karen well enough to recognize when she was preparing for a new campaign. She wouldn't stop. She couldn't. Control was the last thing she had left now that her house was torn apart. And as the sun began to set over the battered neighborhood, casting long shadows over the ruined street, I could feel it brewing. The storm outside had passed, but the one inside Karen had only just begun. By the next morning, the neighborhood felt like it was running on a mixture of adrenaline, exhaustion, and denial. People wandered the streets carrying clipboards, phones, trash bags, anything that helped them feel in control again. Chainsaws buzzed in the distance as volunteers cleared fallen limbs. Insurance adjusters were already driving slowly through the subdivision, taking pictures from their windows. And somewhere in that uneasy calm, I knew Karen was planning her counterattack. It wasn't a question of if she would strike, but what new angle she would invent to justify it. She didn't disappoint. I had barely finished picking broken shingles off my driveway when I heard the familiar sound of her sandals slapping angrily against the pavement. I turned to see her marching straight toward me, holding a clipboard piled with papers that looked suspiciously like forms she had printed during the night. Her posture was rigid, her expression hardened into something that resembled a general rallying troops before a battle. I considered pretending not to notice her, but that would only delay the inevitable. She stopped 3 feet away, lifted the clipboard like a holy artifact, and declared she was launching an official HOA investigation into my shelter. I asked her how that was possible when the HOA board members had already spoken to me. Her jaw tightened, and she insisted she had authority to pursue independent action when the board failed to protect the community. The confidence in her voice made it clear she believed every word, even if none of it was grounded in reality. Before I could respond, she thrust one of the papers at me. It was a homemade form demanding immediate access to my property for storm shelter compliance review. I almost laughed. It wasn't even formatted like a real document. No signatures, no dates, just a series of accusations typed in bold letters. I gave it back to her and said I wasn't signing anything. Her lips thinned into a straight line. She told me refusal would be logged as an admission of guilt. I asked her what exactly she thought I was guilty of. She launched into a speech about community harmony, aesthetic disruption, architectural imbalance, and airflow redirection. By the time she reached the part about storm shelter interference pathways, a small group of neighbors had started gathering behind her, listening in disbelief. One of them, a quiet woman named Denise, stepped forward gently and asked Karen if she was okay. The question wasn't sarcastic. It was genuinely concerned. Karen ignored her entirely and continued her speech as if addressing a crowd of reporters. She insisted the tornado had been influenced by my shelter's location, repeating the phrase so confidently it almost seemed rehearsed. She concluded by saying she would not allow my structure to remain because it posed an ongoing threat. Denise raised her hand again and calmly pointed out that storm shelters save lives. Karen's response was immediate and chilling. She accused Denise of spreading misinformation. The tension grew until finally someone suggested calling another board member over. That was when Karen snapped. She spun around, glaring at the neighbors like they were traitors. She began accusing them of siding with danger, negligence, and disregard for community values. The anger in her voice wasn't the petty kind she usually displayed. It was deeper, fueled by fear she refused to acknowledge. I realized then that the tornado had shaken her more profoundly than she wanted anyone to see. Her obsession with my shelter wasn't just about control anymore. It was about rewriting the narrative so that she wouldn't have to confront her own mistake. When she stormed back across the street, her sandals flapping loudly, the neighbors dispersed slowly, shaking their heads. Some apologized to me for her behavior. Others warned me to stay alert. One man even suggested installing a security camera in case she tried something. I laughed it off at first, but the more I thought about her fixation, the less funny it seemed. She had already tried to block me from using the shelter during the storm. It wasn't hard to imagine her escalating in unpredictable ways now that her house was partly destroyed. Later in the afternoon, an insurance adjuster arrived at my property. He took photos, made notes, and commented that I had gotten off remarkably lucky. When he finished, I walked him down the street to show him the damage to Karen's home. He shook his head sympathetically, not knowing yet what kind of storm she could unleash. As we approached her house, she stepped out onto her porch, chin raised, lips pursed, treating the adjuster like an adversary. She immediately demanded full coverage for what she called unnatural wind manipulation. He frowned and tried to explain that tornadoes don't fall under manipulated circumstances. Her face flushed with anger. She accused him of siding with me before he even knew I lived nearby. He asked her to explain what she meant, and she launched into her airflow theory again, pointing repeatedly at my yard. The adjuster listened politely for a minute before gently telling her that insurance companies don't consider backyards capable of influencing tornadic activity. She stiffened, then asked if he could mark her home as a targeted structure. He answered carefully, explaining that natural disasters don't target specific houses. Her eyes narrowed, and I could practically see the moment she realized she wasn't getting the validation she wanted. When he left, she turned her glare toward me with renewed intensity. She marched down her broken steps and stood so close I could smell the dust still clinging to her clothes. She informed me she would be gathering signatures for a community vote to force the removal of my shelter. I reminded her politely that community votes couldn't override county safety codes or private property right. She flinched as if the truth itself had slapped her. She insisted she would find another way. That was the first moment I felt a twinge of genuine unease. Not fear, but a warning that she wasn't done escalating. By sunset, I had mostly finished clearing my yard. The sky glowed orange and pink, contrasting sharply with the debris scattered along the street. While I worked, I noticed Karen lingering outside her house, pacing back and forth while talking to someone on her phone. Her gestures were sharp, animated, almost frantic. At one point she pointed directly at my property. Whoever was on the other end must have been someone she thought could help her. That alone was worrying. As the light faded, she slammed her phone shut and stormed back inside, slamming the broken door against its mangled frame. The sound echoed across the quiet neighborhood. Something told me she wasn't calling friends for emotional support. She was gathering reinforcements, and I had no idea what she was planning, only that she wouldn't stop until she tried everything she could to destroy my shelter or force me out. The tornado had taken her home, but in her mind I was still the bigger threat. And danger from a person who refuses reality can be far harder to predict than any storm. By the next morning, the uneasy calm that had settled over the neighborhood felt thinner than ever, stretched tight by exhaustion and the quiet dread of whatever Karen planned next. I woke early, long before the sun had cleared the damaged rooftops, because part of me already sensed she wouldn't stay quiet for long. Sure enough, I heard her voice drifting faintly across the street before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. It wasn't angry shouting this time. It was calmer, controlled, the kind of tone she used when she wanted something big. That tone was usually more dangerous than her temper. When I stepped outside, I saw her standing in her yard with a man I didn't recognize. He wore slacks, a pressed shirt, and carried a clipboard, always a bad sign when paired with Karen. I tried to ignore them and go about clearing debris from the back corner of my property, but they moved steadily closer. Within minutes, the man was standing at the edge of my driveway, while Karen hovered behind him with the smug satisfaction of a child showing off a trophy. He introduced himself as an independent property compliance consultant, which already told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't hired by the HOA. He was hired by her. He began asking questions about my storm shelter. Installation date, permits, depth, materials, anchoring methods. I answered politely because I had nothing to hide, but the real issue was Karen lurking behind him, nodding eagerly at every detail as if gathering ammunition. I asked him directly if he had been authorized by the HOA board. He hesitated, glancing at Karen, and the hesitation was answer enough. I reminded him he had no legal authority to inspect private property without permission, and he adjusted his glasses as if trying to figure out how to salvage the situation while Karen shot me a triumphant smirk. When I denied him access, she stepped forward and announced that refusal confirmed my shelter was a danger to the community. I told her again that she had no jurisdiction over my yard. She responded by telling the consultant to document my resistance. He scribbled something down, clearly regretting accepting whatever job she promised him. They eventually left, with Karen announcing she would be escalating the matter to the highest level available. She didn't specify what that meant, but knowing her, it probably involved calling people who were far too polite to hang up on her. The moment they were out of sight, I walked straight to my garage and installed the outdoor security camera my neighbor had offered. I wasn't taking risks anymore. Karen's behavior had crossed a line days ago. Now she was sprinting past the line and dragging random professionals into her personal vendetta. The camera clicked softly as it calibrated, its little indicator light glowing faintly. For the first time since the storm, I felt like I had even ground to stand on. By mid-morning, several neighbors wandered over, curious about why a stranger had been inspecting my driveway. When I explained, their expressions shifted from amusement to concern. Denise shook her head and said she'd never seen anyone unravel so quickly after a storm. Others muttered about organizing a board meeting to address her behavior before she caused more trouble. The solidarity helped, but I still felt that uneasy weight in my chest. Karen wasn't the type to back down when challenged. She doubled down. Every time. And now her house was half ruined, her pride damaged, and her fixation locked entirely on me. Around noon, the HOA board president, an older man named Carl, stopped by. He apologized for the ongoing chaos and told me Karen had demanded an emergency hearing regarding my shelter. He reassured me the board had declined. She apparently reacted by threatening to impeach him, which would have been funnier if she hadn't been dead serious. He told me the board was preparing an official notice warning her to cease unauthorized inspections and frivolous action. But even then, he admitted he wasn't sure she'd listen. When he left, I realized the storm might have toppled half her roof, but her delusions remained perfectly intact. Later in the afternoon, the sound of hammering echoed across my yard. I followed the noise and found Karen attempting to nail a massive plywood board to what remained of her front porch railing. At first I thought she was boarding up a broken area, but then I realized she was making a sign. A very large sign. I watched in disbelief as bold painted letters began to appear. Danger zone created by illegal shelter across street. My name wasn't written there, but she pointed the arrow directly at my house. She stepped back proudly, wiping sweat from her forehead like she had just completed a masterpiece. I walked over, not to argue but because I needed to see her face to understand whether she actually believed this. She did. Every line of panic and frustration etched into her expression told me she wasn't doing this for attention. She was doing it because she had convinced herself she was the victim of some engineering conspiracy. She looked at her damaged home and genuinely believed the universe had targeted her. She pointed at the sign and told me it was her duty to warn others. I asked her calmly to remove it. She refused. I told her the board would order her to take it down. She didn't care. I finally walked away before saying something I'd regret. By evening, the sign had drawn a crowd. Some laughed. Some were embarrassed for her. A few whispered about mental strain after trauma. Karen stood beside the sign like a proud spokesperson defending her findings. Every time someone walked past, she launched into a speech about airflow, redirection, community safety, and the threat posed by my shelter. I could see people trying to be patient, trying not to inflame her, but eventually most drifted away with sympathetic looks aimed in my direction. As night fell, I checked my new security camera feed. Everything seemed quiet. For the first time that day, I let myself relax. I took a shower, changed clothes, and finally sat down on the couch. The house creaked softly in the cooling evening air. I told myself Karen would tire out eventually. Maybe tomorrow she'd find something else to fixate on. Maybe the board's warning would break through whatever spiral she was caught in. But then my phone buzzed. The camera notification lit up the screen. Movement detected near storm shelter. My stomach dropped. When I opened the video feed, the camera image loaded slowly, the night vision glow casting everything in pale green. And there she was, Karen, standing in my yard, holding tools, inspecting my storm shelter door like she had every right in the world to be there. And for the first time since the tornado, I felt something colder and sharper than frustration. This wasn't about complaints anymore. She was escalating. And she was crossing into dangerous territory I couldn't ignore. The moment I saw Karen standing in my yard in the grainy glow of the night vision camera, a cold jolt shot through me hard enough to pull me straight off the couch. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what she was doing. Her posture was hunched, focused, deliberate, nothing like the loud, dramatic woman who usually stormed around in daylight demanding attention. This Karen was quiet. Calculated. She had a flashlight in one hand and what looked like a flathead screwdriver in the other. She ran the beam slowly along the edge of my storm shelter door like she was searching for a weak point. My heartbeat thudded heavy in my ears as every instinct screamed that this had gone far beyond complaining. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was determined to dismantle the one thing that had saved my life. I didn't rush outside immediately. Part of it was caution, part disbelief, part strategy. I watched her from the window first, the camera feed still open in my hand. She crouched down, pressing her ear against the metal as if listening for something inside. Then she wedged the screwdriver into the hinge gap and pushed, testing the resistance. She wasn't strong enough to break anything, but that wasn't the point. She was studying the structure, evaluating it, looking for ways to undermine its stability. My jaw clenched as anger began to boil in my chest. It wasn't just that she trespassed. It was the idea that she might try to sabotage a life-saving shelter in a tornado-prone region simply because it offended her sense of control. I finally stepped outside, but I didn't turn on any lights. I walked quietly across the yard until I was close enough to hear her muttering under her breath. She kept whispering to herself, words spilling in fragments about airflow, vortex influence, community risk, illegal structures. Her voice shook as she talked, not from fear but from obsession. When I spoke her name, she yelped and spun around, flashlight jerking wildly in her hand. The beam hit my face, then my chest, then the grass, trembling. She demanded to know why I was sneaking up on her. The question was so backward it almost stunned me into silence. I told her plainly she was trespassing and needed to leave immediately. She straightened, clutching the screwdriver like a badge of authority, and declared that she had a right to inspect any structure that threatened community safety. I reminded her she had been told, repeatedly, that she had no such authority. She countered by accusing me of hiding something inside the shelter. Something dangerous. Something responsible for the tornado's path. She said it with such intensity that, for a split second, I saw the full weight of her delusion. She didn't just think the shelter was ugly. She genuinely believed it had influenced the storm. That belief had consumed her so completely that she was willing to walk into my yard in the middle of the night and pry at the door of a structure she didn't understand. She stepped closer, face tight with determination. She ordered me to open the shelter so she could evaluate its internal mechanisms. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but the situation had passed the point of humor. I told her firmly that she needed to leave or I would call the police. She held her ground for a long moment, gripping the screwdriver like she believed she was the one being threatened. For a heartbeat, I wondered what she was capable of if cornered. The tornado had taken her house, but obsession had taken her judgment. When I lifted my phone and hovered my finger over the emergency call button, she finally backed up a step, her breath sharp and shaky. She said she would return with someone who understood the science, as if she'd been wronged by the world of meteorology. She stormed out of my yard just as quietly as she had entered, but she kept turning back to glare at the shelter. Even after she disappeared into the darkness, I stood there a long time, staring at the dent her presence had left on the night itself. The silence after she left was heavy, tense, unnatural. I locked the shelter door, double-checked the hinges, and reinforced the latch. When I finally went inside, I replayed the footage again and again, the invasive persistence of her actions making my stomach twist. The storm outside had terrified me, but this was different. A natural disaster doesn't hold grudges. A person does. Morning brought the illusion of normalcy. Birds chirping. Neighbors hauling debris. Insurance adjusters knocking on doors. But underneath the ordinary hum of recovery, a strange tension lingered in the air. When I stepped outside, I noticed 2 board members speaking with residents near the street, probably handling more of Karen's complaints. Yet something felt off. Eyes drifted toward my house more often than usual. Conversations paused when I walked by. Finally, one neighbor approached me and asked quietly whether I knew Karen had started going door to door early that morning. I didn't, but I wasn't surprised. According to the neighbor, Karen was gathering signatures for a petition demanding my storm shelter be removed. She was telling everyone my structure had not only influenced the tornado but also posed an ongoing risk to the entire neighborhood. Her story had evolved overnight. She now claimed the shelter altered wind currents even when closed, creating hazardous conditions. Most people dismissed her, but 1 or 2 were shaken enough by the recent disaster that they listened longer than they should have. Fear makes people vulnerable, and Karen had learned how to exploit that. I found her 3 houses down, holding a clipboard and speaking passionately to a couple who looked trapped by politeness. She saw me and straightened immediately, lifting the clipboard like a shield. She accused me loudly of intimidating residents, even though I had said nothing. I told her again to stop trespassing on my property and stop spreading misinformation. She raised her voice even louder, announcing that I was trying to silence her efforts to protect the neighborhood. Her performance drew several eyes, but instead of sympathy, she drew discomfort. People stepped back. People whispered. People wondered how far she'd go. I took a slow breath and told her calmly that if she stepped onto my yard again, I would involve law enforcement. She opened her mouth, ready to launch another tirade, but this time something stopped her. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. She scanned the small gathering of neighbors watching us and seemed to realize she wasn't winning sympathy. Her eyes narrowed with a cold, simmering resolve. She turned away without another word, but the look she gave me before leaving chilled me more than the tornado sirens. By afternoon, the neighborhood had begun to stabilize again, but my nerves hadn't. Every time a shadow moved or a voice echoed across the street, I wondered whether she was planning another approach. When the sun began to set, I checked the security camera again. Nothing unusual. No movement. For a moment, I almost convinced myself she might be tiring out. Then, just before midnight, the camera buzzed again. Movement detected near storm shelter. I opened the feed with a sinking dread. This time, Karen wasn't alone. She had brought someone with her. And whoever he was, he carried equipment. The kind you don't bring for inspecting. The kind you bring for dismantling. The moment I saw two figures in my yard on the night vision feed, every trace of sleep vanished from my body. Karen stood there like she owned the darkness, her posture rigid and triumphant, while the man beside her knelt at my storm shelter with a tool bag open in the grass. He wasn't the hesitant consultant from before. This man moved with practiced confidence, selecting tools with the ease of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Bolt cutter handles glinted in the faint infrared glow. A long pry bar lay beside him, its weight obvious even in the low light. Karen hovered over him, whispering urgently, pointing at the hinges like she was orchestrating a surgical strike. My stomach twisted with a sharp, heavy dread. This wasn't another inspection attempt. She meant to breach it, to tear apart the only thing that had protected me. The only thing that could protect anyone. I didn't call out. I didn't rush outside this time. I dialed the police first, voice steady but quick as I explained the trespassing, the attempted break-in, the escalation. The dispatcher told me officers were minutes away. I didn't have minutes. The man inserted the pry bar under the bottom hinge and applied pressure. The metal groaned. Karen flinched, then stepped closer, nodding as if approving the progress of a demolition crew she personally commissioned. I gripped my phone tighter, pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my jaw. Watching someone try to break into your storm shelter feels strangely personal, like seeing someone claw at your front door while you're still inside. It wasn't just trespassing. It was deliberate sabotage. I stepped out quietly and moved toward them, not wanting to spook the man into damaging anything further. The grass felt cold beneath my feet. The night air was thick. I stopped a few yards away and said Karen's name firmly. She whipped around so fast her flashlight beams sliced across the trees. The man froze but didn't step away from the shelter. Karen straightened, her chin lifting with that familiar, infuriating arrogance. She announced she was conducting an authorized extraction, a phrase so ridiculous I almost laughed. She gestured toward the man like she was introducing a specialist she'd hired to fix the world. I recognized him now, a contractor known around the county for taking cash jobs with no questions asked. He didn't look thrilled to be caught, but Karen shoved a hand toward him, urging him to continue. I told them both plainly that police were on the way. The contractor stepped back instantly, his instincts kicking in faster than Karen's righteousness. But she threw an arm out in front of him, blocking his retreat like a general preventing a soldier from deserting. She yelled that she had every right to dismantle a structure, posing an active aerodynamic threat. I stared at her, not sure whether to be angry or startled at how deeply she had spiraled. I reminded her that she had no authority to touch anything on my property. Her voice rose, cracking with rage, insisting that my refusal to remove the shelter had forced her into emergency community intervention. The contractor took another step back, muttering something about not being paid enough for this. Then headlights swept across the street as the police car pulled up, and Karen spun around with a look of frantic indignation. The officers got out quickly, hands hovering near their belts but not yet tense. I explained everything calmly, pointing out the tools, the attempted breach, the past incident. Karen interrupted every sentence until one officer held up a hand, telling her to stop talking unless she wanted to make things worse. She froze, stunned that someone dared to silence her, and for the first time I saw something flicker across her face that wasn't anger or delusion. It was fear. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a renewed wave of accusations. She claimed I had built a dangerous, experimental structure that required immediate removal. She insisted the shelter threatened natural airflow, threatened property values, threatened the entire subdivision. The officers exchanged looks that said they'd heard bizarre claims before but rarely delivered with such conviction. One officer inspected the pry marks on the hinge, then turned to Karen and asked if she authorized this man to break into my shelter. She answered proudly that she had authorized a necessary operation. That was all they needed. The officers told the contractor to stay where he was and informed Karen she was being detained pending further investigation. She erupted instantly, her voice spiraling into shrill disbelief as she demanded to know how they could arrest the victim. The officer calmly clarified she was not the victim here. When they handcuffed her, she didn't resist physically, but the verbal storm she unleashed was almost as loud as the tornado had been. She accused me of conspiring with meteorologists, manipulating natural forces, endangering lives, and orchestrating her downfall. The contractor didn't wait for instructions. He sat on the curb with his hands raised, eyes wide, clearly regretting every decision that had brought him to my yard. The officers escorted Karen to the patrol car. She twisted around once more, eyes burning through the darkness, and shouted that this wasn't over. But her voice cracked at the end, a splinter of something raw breaking through the layers of denial. After they drove off with her, the neighborhood slowly woke to the commotion. Porch lights flicked on. Doors opened. People gathered quietly, speaking in low voices as I explained what had happened. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others weren't surprised at all. One neighbor put a hand on my shoulder and said she was sorry it had come to this, but that maybe now Karen would finally get help instead of more reasons to lash out. I wasn't sure whether help was something Karen would ever accept, but I nodded anyway. By sunrise, the contractor had been issued a citation and released. The officers told me they'd add extra patrols to the area until things settled. I thanked them, though it didn't erase the unease sitting at the back of my mind. Karen had been taken away, but her obsession had deep root. Still, for the first time in days, the air felt lighter. The sky was clear. The storm shelter door stood solid and unbroken, a quiet reminder that preparation saves lives even when human chaos tries to tear it apart. As morning light spread over the battered neighborhood, people stepped outside with coffee mugs and tired smiles, ready to rebuild. I looked across the street at Karen's damaged house, quiet and still, and wondered how long she'd be gone. Maybe days, maybe longer. The tornado had taken her roof, but the consequences of her choices had taken something far more important: her unchecked authority, her imagined power, her ability to terrorize the neighborhood without consequences. In the end, the storm hadn't been her downfall. She had always been her own tornado. And this time, she was the one caught in the path she tried so hard to redirect.